So I just want to take a moment and welcome everyone to the Native Center for Behavioral Health. My name is Ella Driscoll, and today Avis Garcia will be presenting Safe at Home Domestic Violence Awareness Series Part 2. This training series is brought to you by the National American Indian and Alaska Native Addiction Technology Transfer Center. We are part of the ATTC network out of Iowa City, Iowa, right here. We will be sharing a link to our GIPRA survey at the end of our session today. This survey takes just a few minutes to complete and asks about your satisfaction with this event. This feedback is critical to our future work, and of course, we value your opinion, and we would love to hear about your time and share your thoughts with us. In the next couple of days, we will send you a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording, a handout of the slides, and a CEU request instructions. We are a NADAC certified educational provider, and we are currently waiving CEU fees throughout the pandemic. Again, the follow-up email will contain instructions for ordering these CEUs. This project is supported by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA. This content is developed by the presenter, and the opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of SAMHSA, HHS, or the American Indian and Alaska Native ATTC. Today you will be muted for the duration of the webinar. Please feel free to use the chat feature to share your questions and comments throughout the presentation, and we will address these questions at the end. Today we will be hearing from Avis Garcia. She is an enrolled member of the Northern Arapaho Nation and affiliated with the Eastern Shoshone Tribe of Wyoming. She earned her doctorate in counselor education at the University of Wyoming, and she is a licensed professional counselor as well as a licensed addiction therapist. For 19 years, she has been a mental health provider in the treatment of Native American youth and families. With that, I want to give a warm welcome to everyone who came here today, and of course to Dr. Garcia. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
All right. I will just pull up your slides.
Okay.
If you are here this week and you attended last week, it's so good to see you guys again. Let's see. Screen 2. Here we go.
Okay. Last week, those of you that have presented, I didn't realize I forgot to do something, and I realized it at the very end when I saw some reactions that people had. I like to preface these types of presentations to remind people that this is a very difficult topic to present, and it could be triggering for some people. And it could raise some uncomfortable emotions and that you might experience from the presentations that I do. So I want to remind everyone to take care of yourself. When this presentation is over, do something for yourself today. Do some self-care. I personally experienced domestic violence, and part of what brings me to this work is some of my life experience. And I lost my mother to domestic violence about 30 years ago. So it's been several years to where I'm at this point in my life that I'm comfortable talking about it. And I see a need to increase awareness and educate the community about domestic violence so that more can be done to help people that need it. So that is my whole goal with this presentation. And I'm really thankful and honored to be asked to do this presentation because I know that it's needed. And throughout my research in creating this presentation, I tried to remain as neutral as possible. However, being an Arapaho female, I'd be less than honest to say that I wasn't able to be fully objective at times, especially when discussing brutal deaths or apathy of our law enforcement and the media. These women that are struggling with domestic violence are real people. And, this continues today. And, I know that from my work. So we can go on ahead and get started with the slides. And thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here today. Go to the next slide. The prevalence of domestic violence for Native American families is that the women in low-income families are the most susceptible to domestic violence. Most are unemployed, and they are often relying on their partners for support. Domestic violence among American Indian women in comparison to other races is at least 50% higher. The occurrence. Domestic violence is often triggered by certain factors that can influence the occurrence of these incidents. Again, unemployment, poverty, poor education background, systemic prejudice, anger management, teen pregnancy, and marriage at early ages due to unplanned pregnancies. So education is very important to have a better future for our younger generations. And domestic violence is not a one-time event. It is cyclical, and the occurrence depends on the presence of these triggers. Next slide. The problem. About 80% of American Indian men and women have experienced violence in their lifetime. American Indian women living on reservations suffer close to 50% of domestic violence compared to women of other ethnic backgrounds. And this is according to data collected by the Department of Justice. There are approximately 574 federally recognized tribes from an article in 2016. And if those haven't experienced domestic violence personally, some experience it secondarily through other family members or close friends and acquaintances. And I'm a storyteller, if you haven't noticed by my presentations, and that's just part of my culture of who I am. As I learned from my grandparents, they often told stories when they were teaching me lessons about life. And I was sharing with my friend who is also a PhD, Danae, and she works at a university in Oklahoma now. She just moved there this fall. And as I was telling her what I was working on, she shared with me again that her son's father had attempted to strangle her, and that she went through a lot of domestic violence. And we had probably a lengthy conversation as I continued to work on my presentation while we FaceTime all the time. And she shared that her grandfather was abusive to her grandmother, and it often happened when he would be under the influence of alcohol. And, I shared with her that, this research is showing a lot of things that lines up with my life experience. And she said she was thankful that her mother and father didn't drink, and that she never saw that with her own parents, but she remembers very well from her grandparents having gone through that. You can go to the next slide. Some of the consequences of interpersonal violence for Native American victims is that it impacts the mental health of affected women, children, and families. And a lot of times when people are in this situation, I don't think they take the time to realize how children can be affected by this problem. Violence against Indigenous women begins at a young age, and it is related to depression, substance abuse, and attempted suicide. Women report feeling more stressed and depressed. 38% report worsened substance use since experience interpersonal violence. And substance use probably accounts for about 60% of the domestic violence. You can go to the next slide. Indigenous women's perspectives, majority of witnessed interpersonal violence. I noticed as time changes, a lot of the vocabulary changes or the description. So domestic violence and interpersonal violence will be used interchangeably throughout my presentation here. And this often leads to intergenerational cycle of violence. And this isn't just for Native people, it's for all races that happens. I read a study by Bandura as I was doing my research on domestic violence. And there was a study where they called it a Bobo doll. It's one of those little punching bags that looks like a little clown. And they showed some kids' situations of people being violent and those not being violent. And then they put the kids with the Bobo doll, and the ones that saw the violent stuff, of course, they pounded on the Bobo doll. And the ones that didn't, they didn't do anything aggressive with the doll. So I thought that was an interesting study to, some people don't realize that, it does affect children. And interpersonal violence is one of the most common forms of violence by a current or former partner. And of course, our Native women are 2.5 times experience it a lot higher, at a higher rate of all non-Indigenous women. You can go to the next slide. Some of the consequences. Research on the consequences of interpersonal violence for Indigenous women is scarce, and this is a problem given its disproportionately high rate of occurrence. And I was sharing with someone as I was doing the research specific to Indigenous people and domestic violence that there's research that's really outdated, and most of that research is not done by Native American people. So it's really, it really has a negative slant to it. I just, I can just tell the difference in the writing and who's doing the work. And very recently, I mean, it was real sporadic, maybe 1 or 2, 3 articles here and there that I could find. So it lets me know that more research is needed in this area. And I would like to say I would recommend Native people do this research from that perspective, because I feel that it's better research for the people coming from Native people. Victims are more likely to report depressive symptoms, substance abuse, and chronic mental illness than non-victims. Places the victims at risk for anxiety, depression, PTSD, antisocial behavior, suicidal thoughts, and emotional detachment. Working as a counselor in the substance abuse field, I see this a lot. And even at just the interview phases of doing assessments on people for substance abuse, I encounter so many women that suffer from PTSD to this day after having been through a domestic violence in their past. And sadly, I encounter women who have been through this with more than one partner. So we can go to the next slide. The effects on children. And again, like I said, we don't stop to think how children are affected. And I often think back of my own experience of witnessing what I saw my own mother go through when I was a child, and even as a young adult, she continued to end up in those types of relationships. It says our children are 5 to 7 times more likely to suffer psychological problems such as childhood depression, anxiety, aggression, insecure attachment, have low self-esteem than those that come from nonviolent households. When looking at the gender differences, about 46% of girls and 22% of boys are at an increased risk for delinquency, violent expressions, and impaired relationships. And as adults, these children can grow up and have psychiatric distress, self-harm, trauma symptoms, depression, underemployment, poor educational attainment, and of course, attachment problems. The next slide. More research on interpersonal violence and its consequences on families is needed. So, we often think about just that person who is the direct victim, but it affects the entire family. It's like dropping a stone into the lake and seeing it ripple out. It has a big effect, even in our communities. So there are psychological consequences from exposure. It indirectly affects by interparental conflict that impairs parenting and parent-child relationships, constrains child development, and it is also found to be transmitted intergenerationally. So I've also done some research on intergenerational trauma and how it relates to substance abuse for Native Americans. And biogenetic research has actually shown that this can be transmitted in our DNA. So there's actual research that comes back from intergenerational trauma from our ancestors and our grandparents, and it continues to transfer genetically. So I thought that was really interesting that this type of research is being done with the modern technology that we have. We could go to the next slide. Some more research outcomes. Women report PTSD, depression, suicide attempts, sleep disruption. They have employment problems. Some of them lose their jobs because of domestic violence and living in constant fear. Symptoms persist for years and decades beyond the violence. Like I shared with you, I have women who are still struggling with drug and alcohol use that still struggle from PTSD from being a victim of domestic violence. And interpersonal violence was normalized in their own childhood, making them more at risk for being a victim. So again, that's what they saw. That's what they thought life was all about. I myself am thankful for having pursued education to increase my own awareness, and having experienced what I went through with the loss of my own mother made me realize that, hey, I don't want to live a life like this. It's time to break the cycle and not have this continue for my children or my own grandchildren. So it can be stopped. Children are indirectly affected by loss of a parent. And my younger sister was 8 years old when we lost our mother. So I've seen her go through a lot, and I feel like she still goes through a lot because of that. So it's a very hard thing to see. So we can go on to the next slide. The history of the problem, it cannot be accurately established when exactly this domestic violence began. It is believed the invasion and subsequent colonization by the British may have started this, which has been exacerbated by unemployment and deplorable living conditions. Domestic violence has become a common healthcare problem. And like I was sharing with you that, oftentimes once or twice a year, I'll have a very bad migraine. And if I go to the emergency room, I'm always asked if I'm in, has somebody hurt me, or am I experiencing domestic violence? So they do screen for that because it is common. Can go to the next slide. This is the continued history that I was looking at. Every minute, at least 20 people suffer physical assault by intimate partners. This is also influenced by high drug and substance abuse, psychological imbalance, and increased insecurity. The sequelae of domestic violence can be physical, emotional, mental, and I should have added sexual there as well. The physical sequelae includes permanent scars, deformation, and in extreme cases, even death. More on the history. Physical genocide ceased in the late 1800s. Native people were affected by, and still continue to be from my viewpoint, affected by US government policies and programs that still had genocide in mind. But it was just more subtle, such as the Indian Removal Act, the residential schools, and forced sterilization. These were all tactics by the government to subdue, control, and marginalize Native people. The Indian Removal Act was signed into law in May 1830 by President Andrew Jackson. The law authorized the president to negotiate with Southern tribes for their removal to federal territory west of the Mississippi so that they could take over their ancestral lands, which has happened to many tribes, including my own. And this act has been referred to as a unitary act of genocide because it discriminated against ethnic group of Native Americans as far as to make certain the death of a vast numbers of its population, signed by Andrew Jackson under the administration of Martin Van Buren, extended into 1841. The Cherokee worked to stop this relocation, but were unsuccessful and forcibly removed by the US government in the march later known as the Trail of Tears. So every tribe has been through some traumatization in their history. Could go to the next slide. Under the US Army and during the Civil War, one of these quotes has always stuck out for me. And one of them is, to kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone. Buffalo were slaughtered that were once in the millions, and Native people, especially the Plains Indians, including the Arapaho people, the buffalo, following that buffalo was a way of life. That was our survival before colonization. And of course, the Civil War wanted to take all the land and expand westward. You know, they were willing to do whatever it took to get whatever they wanted. And doing that, they nearly starved to death and forced natives to rely on government-issued rations that were often spoiled. Can go on to the next slide. Here's a picture that I often shared in some of my presentations when I was pursuing my PhD degree. And I also like to share with people that I didn't go back to school for my PhD until I was 47. I waited till my youngest graduated from high school, and I decided this was something I wanted to do now that my kids were all raised. And anyway, this picture is a pile of buffalo skulls, and I can't even begin to count. Another picture with this shows piles of buffalo hides. So this is all the government and how they're standing there posing like they're so proud of what they're doing. And this was acceptable at that time to them. So this really saddens me that this happened. You can go to the next slide. The other contributing factor, I feel, is the cultural genocide. No one objected. Richard Henry Pratt of the US Army, who developed the first Indian boarding school, then reservation boarding schools were established. And tearing apart families, taking the children away from their parents. My own grandparents that raised me were taken away from their parents. And I think I shared in one of my many presentations that I've been doing that my grandfather ran away when he was in the 6th grade. And many kids that attempted to run away didn't survive running away from the boarding schools. So I was thinking, I'm just amazed that my grandfather at 12 or 13 years old was able to run away and find his parents. But all these programs and policies were more related to cultural genocide than physical. So they wanted to remove the Indian part of us and make us like white people. The good European society was fine with it. Another quote that I see often is referring to boarding schools as kill the Indian and save the man. So the Carlisle Indian School was a model for Indian education. You can go to the next slide. In my research, I've come across this excellent book by Ward Churchill. He was not a Native American, but he's written a lot of really good books on Native American history. And he was a very strong advocate for Native American people. So if I could recommend a book, if anyone's interested, that this book covers the boarding school experience from 1875 to 1928. So it's a really in-depth study that's really good. We can go to the next slide. This is a picture of a bunch of Native children at the Carlisle Indian School. And I'm looking at all these pictures. More than once I've looked at these pictures of these children and how sad they all look. It's very heartbreaking. My tribe personally had some students taken from our reservation during this time period and sent to the school. This book is available on Barnes and Noble. Usually Amazon is my go-to place for books, but Barnes and Noble has that book. Somebody was asking. We can go to the next slide. About a year ago, the Arapaho tribe actually was able to go to the Carlisle School, to the mass cemetery there where many of our children never made it home. And we're one of the first tribes who actually were able to get the remains of a northern Arapaho boy named Little Plume and brought him back to Wyoming after a century of having been in that boarding school graveyard. And his remains were brought home and services were held for him. And it was a very tough time for our tribe back home. And you see the horse that has no rider up front that's one of our traditional ways of we put that horse for that person. So that's for not riding, that's for that person who was lost. And this is very emotional experience. And I believe you can go on YouTube and there are some videos on this event that took place on our reservation. So we can go to the next slide. Another shocking thing that I discovered was this forced sterilization. It was estimated that about 25% of Native American women who were of childbearing age were sterilized by 1976. They were coerced into signing forms at Indian Health Services. And 2 15-year-old Native girls who were admitted for tonsillectomies in the northern Cheyenne area were released with tubal ligations. And several women who went to the Indian Health Service hospitals for appendectomies in Aberdeen, Albuquerque, Oklahoma City, and Phoenix found out that they had relinquished their right to bear children. The Indian Health Services has never apologized for this. Go to the next slide. As I was doing research, like I said, there's not a lot out there, but I came across an interesting article on urban Indian women. It is estimated that about 60% of our American Indian population resides in urban settings now. And I was thinking to myself that I have family in California, like in Los Angeles, family up in Seattle, and I have some cousins living in Denver. So a lot of people do move, and I think a lot of them do it for survival reasons. Some people are able to get more better jobs there. And some people just want to get away from the reservation life. This one study that I looked at was done with 112 women in New York City that were Native American women. And the statistics from it showed that 65% of these women experienced some form of interpersonal violence. 28% had experienced childhood physical abuse. Almost half had been raped. 40% had a history of domestic violence at some time in their life. And 40% had multiple victimization experiences. So sadly, many women go through this more than once. You can go to the next slide. According to a national violence survey, Native American women experience the highest rates of all forms of violence, with 34.1% reporting rape, 61.4% physical assault, 17% some sort of stalking, and also the highest rates of being a witness to traumatic events. Go to the next slide. Looking at another study on reservation-based women, this study in particular done by Evans, Campbell, Lindhorst, Wang, and Walters in 2011. Like I said, research is very minimal that I could find. And out of 16,000 women, the 88 that they did qualitative interviews with had experienced 27% had childhood physical abuse, 40% child sexual abuse, 40% adult sexual assault, 67% physical violence from an adult partner, 60.7% attended mental health counseling, and 67.9% utilized traditional Native healing. Go to the next slide. And as I was visiting with my friend, who's teaching in Oklahoma now, she's a professor. We met up in Chicago at a Native American institute, and we've been friends ever since. But as I was talking to her, of course, she brought up the men. What about the men? And I'm like, yeah, there is a lot of stuff on men. And so I'm sharing a little bit about what I did find. Of our Indigenous men, there is very little activism to address men's issues. And there are very few social programs designed for men. There are, however, emerging Indigenous masculinity studies done by Native people. So I'm very proud of our Native professionals we're moving up in the ranks. Our numbers of tribal members who are earning college degrees is increasing. And that really makes me happy because that's what's needed. I got this information from a book that I would recommend if you're interested in studying more about Indigenous men. It's called Indigenous Men and Masculinities. You can get this on Amazon. It's Legacies, Identities, and Regeneration. And this is edited by Robert Alexander Innes and Kim Anderson. And this is several essays done by Native researchers on Native men that is very interesting. So I highly recommend that book. A lot of men's issues are largely ignored. There seems to be more focus on women. Men's issues, Native American men, are very similar to those of women. More men are murdered than women are. Our Indigenous men are 2.5 more times likely to be a victim of homicide. We go to the next slide. On Indigenous men continued. Sadly, Indigenous men have shorter lifespans, less likely to graduate high school, more likely to be incarcerated, murdered at a higher rate. There's also a lack of public awareness about this problem and political will. Who is walking with our brothers? It is perceived that women face a higher violence risk, but both Indigenous men and women are at risk of going missing. As I was reading this, I couldn't help but think about my uncle, who I was just a year older than him, but he was more like a brother as we grew up together. He went missing in, I want to say 2000. Gosh, it's been that long. He went missing. And it made me sad to hear my own son, because he's still living in the house that my grandparents left me on the reservation. And he said, sometimes I think when I walk out this door that, he thinks of my uncle walked out this door of my grandparents' house and was never seen again. He was missing for about 6 months. And people even contacted me because I wasn't living on the reservation at the time. I was about 2 hours away. And they thought maybe he came to come and stay with me. And they were looking everywhere. But I remember his mom finally got the strength to go back to work, because she worked for the tribe, and she would work. And after she got off of work, she would continue to go look for him. She's not here anymore, but by the time they found him 6 months later, his skull had been so badly fractured, somebody had beaten him. And, this has never been solved. So I often think somebody out there has gotten away with murdering one of my family members, and we may never know who it is. Go to the next slide. The significance of the problem. Emotional sequelae include PTSD and persistent anxiety. Statistics indicate that due to limited resources and informed knowledge, they will continue to suffer such atrocities. There is a need for intervention and increased awareness, as well as improved legal actions to curb incidents of domestic violence and improve the continuing problem with people at risk for domestic violence. Some of the resources that I found on the next slide that are problem areas is one of the main triggers has been linked to established resources, being there's none. Basic resources of food and water are required for human existence. Many people are unable to meet their basic needs, which reduces their purchase capacity. And just provision of these resources can serve as primary prevention. So those that can qualify for food stamps and commodities, that's actually, a form of prevention by helping people. And so to the next slide. More resources continued that were identified by people interviewed across the country. In one study that I was able to find from 2011, I believe, it says there's a lack of access to facilities and community activities that improve team building and interpersonal relations. that are crucial to building character and focused on conflict resolution. Practice of better communication channels is fundamental in improving conflict resolution between high-risk young couples. The lack of access to facilities. Several years ago, I know there was a house on our reservation that one of my aunts used to run, and it's no longer there anymore. The only program that does have a safe house to shelter women is off the reservation in one of our border towns. So I'm going to assume that a majority of these women that need some place to go are probably not going to want to go there because it's ran by non-native people. But as I did some work on my reservation when I was working on substance abuse prevention, we discovered that having activities in the community that brings the community together, that doesn't involve drug and alcohol, was probably one of the best things that you could do for your reservation community, even if it is a basketball tournament. You know, it brings people together in a good way. You can go to the next slide. Other issues identified were complications with existing services for Native American domestic violence clients, shelters, counseling, workshops, classes, transportation and court, and beds to house women with multiple children. In my research and looking at help seeking, because I am a professional counselor and therapist, I have done research on Native American help seeking, and most people, Natives, do not use mental health counseling. One reason is they don't want to open up to someone who is a stranger, much less somebody who is not like them. Of all women, approximately 20% of domestic violent clients do not use counseling, and 80% don't use at all. Many of them are ashamed of what's going on in their home. So this is one of those kept secrets, are the elephant in the living room that nobody wants to talk about. And more people are talking about it. If you get on YouTube and if you look up Native Americans and the domestic violence or the missing, murdered, and Indigenous women's movement, you'll find several videos that, I mean, they just go on and on and on. And I was amazed at how many there were. And rather than show them here, I thought I would just direct you to them if you're interested. Check them out. Go on to the next slide. There is an absence of services. Native American domestic violence victim state services are absent on tribal land, as is the case on my reservation. There are no domestic violence support groups. They feel that there's no local tribal support. There is an absence of daycare assistance so that someone can watch the kids. So maybe the mom can go get a job so that she can support her own children. No victim compensation, and awareness of services that are available, if any, from the tribes. You can go to the next slide. Sadly, there is also a tolerance of domestic violence by family and tribal members. Law enforcement officials not taking domestic violence situations seriously. Law enforcement has actually told people that they always return to their abuser, so it's a waste of their time to try to do anything to help them. And then there's always those family that turns against them. They lose faith and trust in law enforcement. They're discouraged from reporting abuse, and they have a fear about law enforcement. Go to the next slide. The other thing in some Native communities is isolation. There is extreme isolation on tribal land. My reservation is like 2.5 million acres, and there are like maybe 3 major communities. The one west is the Shoshone tribe. The middle is where I'm from, and that's the Ethity area. And then there's the lower end. So there's just, everything is far apart. Almost every place you need to go, you need a vehicle to get there. Also faced with having to endure the ongoing abuse because of the isolation that they're experiencing. Some have to leave the reservation to obtain services because this isolation prohibits them from getting the assistance that they need. I think I shared at my last presentation that I came across a young student here. I have supervised school counselors under one of my contracts here, and this Native student was from home, and I know I'm probably related to him, but his mother had left the reservation from domestic violence situations. So we had to find some resources to help that family get what they needed. Could go to the next slide. One of the big things we need, and that's why I say it doesn't matter how old you are, you can help. You don't have to have a college degree to help. It's just the desire. Native providers understand sensitivity to the culture. They're able to relate to the clients better. They can establish more rapport and empathy. The Native provider can make a connection right away with that person. So there is a huge need for more domestic violence providers that are Native. You can be a volunteer, you could make donations, and that's just people that are willing to share and willing to help. So it takes a lot of people being willing to step outside of their own life and help people. And go to the next slide. There's also a need for culturally sensitive training. More culturally sensitive training and cultural understanding is needed. Services need to be changed or adapted to fit Native American clients. Most classes, counseling methods are Western oriented and not made for Native people. There are a few resources that I think are very helpful, but there's just a few. One that I like is called Healthy Relationships. And it is by the Native Wellness Institute right here. I don't know too many people that are using this anymore. And then there's also a Positive Indian Parenting program by NICWA. This program used to be used on the Wind River or Arapaho tribe white buffalo, and they might still be using it. I don't know what they're using, but I do know they would bring elders in for that parenting class, and they provided a meal, and that went very well. So that's one of the few things I know that were going on. If you go to the next slide, I'm looking at the time. We need more tribal education on this issue. Tribal service providers and leaders need to be educated about it. Education must begin with our leaders because they're the ones that have the power and the ability to make any changes. And they need to understand that domestic violence isn't something to be ashamed of addressing, and that it's only going to help people. And it also needs to be recognized as a serious problem. The next slide. Communication value, communication breakdown is one of the major causes of domestic violence. And I want to say in any race, it doesn't mean just for Native Americans. It affects young couples as they're not mature enough to handle parenting pressure and marriage in low-income society. Communication allows for quick and amicable resolutions that prevent the occurrence of domestic violence. The next slide is some of the regulatory issues. Most common regulatory measures put into place to reduce domestic violence is the Stand Against Violence and Empower Native Women, called SAVE. This was in 2012. And this is one of the campaigns that has been employed to reduce cases of domestic violence, to empower women, and advising them of the issues regarding interpersonal violence. Legal considerations on the next slide. Violence Against Women Act. This was reauthorized by President Barack Obama, sorry, got a little tongue twisted. The US Department of Justice in 2017 had the Violence Against Women Act that restores sovereignty and jurisdiction to tribal courts, allowing them to investigate and prosecute tribal members and non-Indians who perpetuate acts of violence in 2017. Prior to that, non-Native men could commit crimes of domestic violence on the reservation and basically get away with it just because we had no jurisdiction to impose sentencing on them. The next slide. Ethical considerations is domestic violence is a very sensitive issue and requires a lot of care when you're dealing with the victims. We have to maintain autonomy and confidentiality of the victim and grant their wishes. As I shared, I have offered counseling to young Native couples, and they have come. They don't keep coming, but they do come for a while. So I often hope what little they got was very helpful to them for their kids' sake. The next slide. Minimizing risk to the victims is also important. Limiting exposure to the victim to repeated acts of violence in their delivery of care. Maintaining our professional boundaries and not imposing our personal values. The next slide is our role as a community helper. It's complicated and dynamic. Helpers can be counselors, trained advocates, or community volunteers. It is both complicated and dynamic, but it impacts the influence of our patient outcomes. Helpers have an integral role to play to ensure early intervention and possible prevention. There are 3 levels of prevention, with the first being primary on the next slide. It seeks to address the issue before it occurs, involves education of public and high-risk areas. Adolescents are the most susceptible because of peer pressure and lack of proper education. Adolescent dating violence is one of the most promising programs for youth on amicable conflict resolution and anger management. So being able to address these early on, I would say even as late as the end of the junior high years, I wish somebody would have educated me to that, because I really didn't get educated until I lost my mother and decided to become an advocate myself. Then there's secondary prevention. On the next slide, it's commonly referred to early intervention, and this is intervention for youth, couples in high-risk setting areas, and improved parenting programs. Secondary prevention is to improve knowledge and understanding of the youth regarding gender roles, interpersonal behavior, and engaging them in team activities. The next slide, there's some more secondary prevention. Couples are at a high risk of violence, especially young couples with low income, and helping them to become aware of their roles in the family upbringing and how each of them is crucial to the success of their family by getting them involved in family activities. And active participation in parenting and parenting education to help relieve frustrations that some people might be going through as young parents. And then the third level is the tertiary prevention. Involves a number of intervention activities, including advocacy, treatment, and rehabilitation of the victim and perpetrator. Victims will require treatment and rehabilitation to overcome physical, mental, and emotional trauma. And perpetrators, they also need recovery through rehabilitation process to ensure recidivism and improve their future family relations. Getting closer to the end here. I am a strong advocate and supporter of the Murdered, Missing, and Indigenous Women's Act state of affairs. Last year, I shared my personal experience of losing my mother 30 years ago. And whenever I'm asked, I'm always honored to be a part of sharing with people This crisis is still unknown to many people. Decades of media has deemed the deaths or disappearances of our Indian women and girls as unnewsworthy. The media can play a role in supporting Indigenous people if they choose to do so. And I want to say it might have been a couple years ago, the movie Wind River, and several of my non-Native friends all asked me about that movie. And I was like, yeah, it was a good movie, but it doesn't really depict my tribe and how they would actually have handled that situation. And the woman who actually wrote that book is a social worker who lives in Utah. And I thought it was really interesting that that a movie was made out of her book. But like my own friends and family also asked, did you see that movie? What did you think of that movie? And I said, well, the message I got from it, was just to, our young women are at a risk, and especially when they're interacting with people that are non-Native, can be very dangerous when they don't know the situation that they're getting into. But in the end, our Indigenous women have been harmed in many ways. Colonization has disassociated women from everything they have valued, including our community and spirituality, our culture, and sense of self. Indigenous women are strong mentally and spiritually, and we're also very resilient. 100 years ago, the US Army stated they would not stop until all the Indians were gone. But despite everything, we're still here. The fact that we still exist speaks volumes. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much for that, Avis. We have a couple quick questions before people have to go.
Okay.
Are Indigenous men incarcerated more than Black men?
I didn't look at that specific statistic, but I would look at incarceration rates by the Department of Justice, and I would say they've got to be pretty similar.
Yeah. Someone else said, if this is a serious issue, or these are serious issues, why aren't there treatment and services available on the reservations?
That's a good question. That's exactly what I pointed out in this presentation today, is this isn't being done, and it needs to be done to help people. And I'm not sure if it's, we just don't have the funding. I know my tribe, for example, relies heavily on federal funding through federal grants through the federal government, and those are highly competitive. So I know there is money out there. The Department of Justice has a conference every 2 years, and if you sign into their website, they often list funding that's available and grants that people can apply for, but something more needs to be done.
Yes, definitely. A few people are wondering, do you have article links for the Indigenous men's reports and the book that you mentioned?
I am sorry. I can make one for you guys, and I thought about that as I just finished this up, that I shared a couple of books, and I have the articles. I either downloaded them on my computer, a few I have printed out, but I can put together a resource page. I'm going to do a final domestic violence presentation in November, and that one will be more focused on children and how they're affected by domestic violence. And if I don't get it out to you guys before then, I'll make sure that I include it in that next presentation that I do in early November, so that everyone can pull those up and take a look at them. I Googled, and a lot of the articles that I would try to find took me to some journal that wanted me to pay a lot of money just to get that article. So I would kind of skip over that one. So like I said, there more research needs to be done, but I will share what I did use for this in my next presentation, and I'll make note of it on a separate page that this is specifically for this presentation.
Yeah, for sure. One last question. There's an article in the current issue of Nation magazine that law enforcement has not been successful in decreasing domestic violence. What is needed more is social support and housing for victims. Would you agree, or do you have more to add?
I would highly agree. Housing where I come from, affordable housing, is very limited, and this coronavirus has shown that we have 2 and 3 families living under one roof. And my son-in-law, he shared that his grandmother has like several of his cousins living together, and I've even gone there, and the summertime some of them may actually have a tent outside the house because they're a young couple with low to no income. And you know, we try to take care of each other. That's why we take people in. So when this coronavirus hit, a lot of families got hit because we're all living together. We don't have a lot of housing that's adequate for our people. And yes, social support is needed for people. It's very badly needed, and I just feel like there's not a lot of support behind it. I'm like, where are the people that need to help these people? That what, you know, more needs to be done. And I really feel the government level, when you vote for those tribal council members, ask them, what are you doing about this issue? What do you think about this? If I'm going to vote for you, I want to make sure you're going to address what I think is important.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it looks like we are out of time for today.
Okay.
Thank you so much for, again, another incredible presentation. Thank you so much for this presentation. Some of these things I've learned about, but having domestic violence framed specifically for Native women and Native men is incredibly difficult to find. Even going to a university, you know, that's just not out there. So this information is incredibly rare and so important. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it. All right, and thank you everyone for attending. We really appreciate you and all your comments and questions, and we will be sending out a follow-up email in the next few days. And until then, please check out in the coming weeks, we will be sending out an announcement with the registration link for AVIS's next event on domestic violence. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.